once I had finished my 4 years at Central, and they didn't want to keep me since I didn't finish the PhD, I then moved on to Seattle, and that's where I was able to win a job with a group called the Dorian Group. The Dorian Group was a gay rights organization that had been formed a couple of years before, had sort of a lineage from Stonewall, in the sense that after Stonewall there was a group called the Seattle Gay Alliance here in Seattle around 1969, I think they formed. That was Stonewall time, and one of the groups formed from that was the Seattle Gay News, another the Counseling Service, another was the Dorian Society, and then that group went through its lifespan, and the Dorian Group was formed and used the same name. It was a closet name. It was related to the Doric Greeks and their traditions of approval of homosexuality, at least in certain forms. And it was largely a group of people who worked downtown, middle-class people who were interested in getting together and having a meal and having a speaker and getting to know leaders in the community. They had things, one of the more well-known events that I didn't attend because I wasn't here yet was when the acting chief of police was their guest speaker, and the Freedom Socialists and others were picketing outside the restaurant because they had the chief of police, the acting chief of police, present. The idea of talking with the police was kind of like talking with the enemy. But the Dorian Group was very careful to control photographs and so on and so forth. And by 1977, they were able to win some funding that led to having a staff position called the office manager. So I competed for that and won that job, and then opened this office in the Smith Tower. And I ended up working for 11 years in the Smith Tower. So I'm kind of launching into my narrative history of
I love it.
My involvement in the movement here. The Smith Tower I had come to love because while in Ellensburg I had become involved with the small group that made up the chapter of the ACLU for Kittitas County. And I was selected to be the board representative, which meant that once a month I would come over to Seattle usually on Friday night. I would go to Greyhound and take the bus over and get some dinner and go to the Sultan Cinema, which was on First Avenue. It was a full-size theater for gay porn, and so I watched the latest 70s porn, and then went to the Atlas Club Baths, which is where Benaroya Hall is now, and had a good night there usually, and then went to the Smith Tower on Saturday for what proved usually to be an all-day ACLU board meeting. And they had their offices on the 21st floor of the Smith Tower, and the meetings were held in the 18th floor in a conference room. And I just got really involved in the issues that the ACLU was concerned with. The Skokie, Illinois issues came up at the time regarding Nazis parading in Skokie, and the ACLU defended their right to parade, and this led to a lot of loss of certain members and so forth, but it was still a good example of the ACLU's stand on principles, and I was attracted to that. I felt that there wasn't really a good appreciation of the import of sexual minority rights and issues in the ACLU. So one of the first projects that I got involved with independently was to work on a committee on sexual minority rights. And so a small group of us won board approval to be a committee and actually do some formal work. And
what year was it?
This was about 1974 to 6, somewhere in there. And then
pretty ahead of its time.
A little bit ahead of its time, but there was already work being done nationally in ACLU and other places in ACLU. I mean, that was 7 years after Stonewall, so there was I was in Boston there was a gathering I was invited to that of gay men on Sunday mornings in the upstairs windowless room of a restaurant in the Back Bay, where the topic was have breakfast together and then listen to a presentation by a doctor talking about venereal disease, which was very helpful to hear, but also then an attorney talking about what to do if you're caught having sex, and the penalty for sodomy, which included oral or anal sex, was 14 years in prison, potentially. So I figured I owed Massachusetts quite a lot of time, but I did leave there after 6 years. And they ultimately changed their laws, as did Washington in 1976, when we adopted the recommended crime code, which did not include sodomy as a statute, as part of the statutes. Where was I now? Let's see. Well, the Committee on Sexual Minorities, we encountered a fair amount of liberal heterosexual resistance. That is, they felt that our oppressions and our issues were relatively less important than those of racial minorities or women, because we were, after all, relatively well off, they thought, as a minority, that we had a lot of disposable income and et cetera, et cetera. And they did not see the range of homosexuality in society and the way in which it is expressed at all levels of economic and social difference. And we felt that it was important to articulate those issues and be sure that people understood their significance. Not that we were getting into the game of comparative oppression, that was not the point. But since we were engaged in the issues of oppression and inequality and unfairness to people based upon characteristics of who they were, but also things they have chosen. After all, in the Constitution, freedom of religion is something one chooses to exercise. You choose your religion. You're not born with it as a characteristic, and we guarantee that as a right. But also freedom based upon race, which is not something that you can choose and is not something that you can change, is an issue for which protection is sought among civil libertarians, at least. And so homosexuality seemed to me to be very much the same thing. Whether it was a matter of choice or a matter of nature or nurture, it was definitely something that was important at a constitutional level. And so I held out for that, and so did others, and we eventually won the support of the ACLU, and people have seen the ACLU as a great leader in this field ever since, not just in Washington, but I mean throughout the country. I served briefly as the acting director for the ACLU, and just before the current director was selected, and she's still there, Kathleen Taylor. She does a great job. And then in looking for a job, I found a job with King County, also in the Smith Tower, but an agency known as the Work Training Program. And so I went and sold my skill as a typist, and became basically the support person for the project manager or the program manager. And then, as it turned out, he was gay, and we in time became collaborators in the gay movement, at least over cocktails after work. We had many good discussions, and he became later one of the presidents in the history of the Dorian Group, as I was.
What was his name?
His name was Jim Holm. And then I'm getting ahead of myself, though, in a sense. The president of the Dorian Group when I was hired in 1977 was a man named Charles Bryden. And Charlie has been very important leader in this area, and nationally too. For a while he was leader of the National Gay Task Force in Washington, D.C., or in New York City. he and I were both interviewed for that job, but he got it. So he lost and I won. It was a hard job for him, for anyone. But we worked together. I mean, I clearly worked for him. He was the boss, but I undertook to run a good office, to get the newsletters together and keep the mailing list together. And we had as many as 1,000 members throughout the state. Primitive technology for keeping mailing lists and such, but it worked, and we had volunteers to help us sort things by zip code and so on, so we could do bulk mailings and what have you. And so this was in the spring of 1977, and after a while, a woman named Anita Bryant became very well known about that time for her work in Dade County, Florida, leading an effort to protect children, she said, by getting rid of ordinances that protected homosexuals from discrimination in employment and housing. And her crusade went on from there to St. Paul, Minnesota, and Wichita, Kansas, and Eugene, Oregon. And we felt in Seattle vulnerable because in 1973 and 1975, the city council had adopted ordinances against discrimination in housing and employment, and had given the Office for Women's Rights a role in the role of enforcement. And so one day that summer, I got a phone call at the office from Wayne Angevine, who was the city clerk, and he let me know that 2 police officers from Seattle had just filed Initiative 10, which was going to be thrown out because it was incompetent as to form and didn't comply with the rules. But it was to get rid of an ordinance protecting us in employment that they had heard of. And then I passed the word on to Charlie, and he started to organize the community from there. And then Initiative 11 was filed, which was, they had heard about the housing part, and they'd also got the correct format together. Initiative 12 was filed because of some additional changes. And then finally, Initiative 13, great number for them, was filed would be in the fall election in 1978. And that became a very critical election for us in 78. However, just to jump back, in 77, Charlie and others in the community, including Councilmember Rasmussen, who was involved with it, formed a group called SEAMEC, the Seattle Municipal Elections Committee for Gays and Lesbians. And that group was to follow the example of some organizations like MECLA in Los Angeles, and to interview candidates and issue ratings so that gay and lesbian voters would know how candidates stood on our issues. And so I volunteered. I was office manager of the Dorian group. A man named Randy Henson was brought into our office with a new desk and as the office manager for SEAMEC, and he was busy getting that group organized. And they registered over 3,000 voters for that municipal election, and that really turned heads in Seattle and made a difference. People noticed that number of registrars volunteering and adding voters to the rolls, and then putting out a report of interest to the community. Well, I volunteered to serve on the evaluation committee and became co-chair of the evaluation committee of 11 people, diverse people, somewhat difficult people sometimes. And our task was to develop a set of questions to interview candidates with who were running for mayor, city attorney, city council, and then to schedule those meetings, those interviews, and to present the results of our interviews to the steering committee of SEAMEC, who ultimately would issue the report. And it was really interesting work that summer, I must say. I studied a lot of the methods in other organizations and came up with a set of rules that I think are largely still followed. But we found that they worked. The worst thing we could have done was to argue over every single question that we might ask. And to keep from doing that, I simply asked the group to brainstorm the questions that they wanted to cover. And we got a nice long list. I think it distilled into 41 questions to ask the candidates. And it included some things about how do you stand on women's rights and women's right to choose and so forth, other issues. What have you read about homosexuals? That was a good question, a very hard one for people. So 41 questions, well, you could have quite a discussion over that and as to which question should get asked. Because in the course of an interview, we weren't sure we could get that many questions asked. And so I said, well, let's do it this way. We've distilled the questions into, so we've combined ones that are similar enough into questions that people agreed to. Let's rank order them. But remember, you're doing this for the lesbian gay community, so don't do it according to your own bias. Try to do it according to your appreciation of what the community as a whole, what their interest is in this subject, whatever it may be. And then ask the question of which is the most important of all these questions, the one that's most important to you for the lesbian gay community to know about. And that's what they did, is they went through that process with me of giving the most important, the least important, and so forth, until we had everyone had rank ordered everything. Then we just did the math. And we did the math and got the questions into an order where we said, what we're agreeing to is that the question that came up with the top score is going to be the one that we ask first, therefore, at every interview. And the last question on the list may or may not get to that. We seem to get to the last question almost every time. But it really was a good way to accommodate everyone's differences. And we then issued our ratings after having these interesting interviews with people like Charles Royer, who became the mayor, Paul Schell, who was running for mayor and later became mayor in another election, members of the city council, Randy Revelle, who later was county executive, and quite a number of people that I got to know through the course of those interviews, and that year and the next year, in 1978. And it was after that I became co-chair of SEAMEC for a couple of years. And so while I was no longer participating in the interviews, was definitely involved in the process and the organization. SEAMEC's my favorite organization, my favorite child of all the groups that I had some involvement with beginning, because it's always operated on a shoestring. It's always operated by volunteers. They're always begging for help, and people are coming forth and providing the help, and they're finding new ways to do things, and they've expanded their scope. They cover all kinds of the judicial races as well as municipal races. They cover throughout this Puget Sound region as well as, but not just Seattle. And it's now called the Seattle Metropolitan Seattle Metropolitan Elections Committee, and they're doing a great job. And I use their report every time I cast a ballot, because all other things being equal, I'm going to vote pro-gay, and so are thousands of other people. And that's what we learned in 1977 that would happen. The politicians who went through our interviews sat up and took notice. Those were sophisticated sets of questions that covered a wide range of things.
What was the first question on that list?
I don't remember now.
Okay.
But the questions, tended to cluster around, what do you know about gay rights? What have you read? What is your sense of the importance of protection from discrimination? And that was the main thing we were working on, was the state law against discrimination. Had been proposed to change that, and one of the projects the Dorian Group had taken on was to amend the state law on discrimination by adding sexual orientation to the categories on which discrimination was prohibited in things like housing, employment, but also licensing and insurance and lots of other areas, public accommodations. And so that was introduced in 1977. There was a hearing held in the state Senate in Olympia, and I was still a civilian in Ellensburg, and I wrote a 10-page paper that constituted my testimony, which I took to the hearing and turned in, and I said this was my testimony as a private citizen, just the reasons I felt that this law should be enacted. Senator Pete Francis of Seattle had the Judiciary Committee, and he held this hearing. Well, it got a lot of attention. Dave Kopay, who was the first openly gay NFL player in the world to come out, testified, and there was a lot of opposition testimony as well. But the project really attracted attention and also helped the Dorian group to grow in size and showed it had a statewide scope. It was not just a group of Seattleites working for Seattle issues. And that bill continued as a project of the Dorian group throughout its existence and became an issue for successor organizations because it took 29 years before it was finally passed. And I'm glad to say that I was in the Senate gallery the day that bill finally was voted passage by the Senate. The House had already passed it 29 years later. And the night before, I had found my testimony. I'd been looking through my papers for it. I thought I had lost it. And I had found a copy of my testimony and carried it with me to Olympia, made copies and took them down to give out to people just to say, I was here at the start and I'm here at the finish. And it was very exciting. And of course, the governor signed it into law later, and it is now the law of the land here.